Welcome to Made for More. I am your host, Holly J. Moore. On Made for More, we try to give you a tool on each and every episode to show up as the best version of yourself. Because we don't want you just surviving through life, we want you absolutely thriving. I am joined today and every day by my producer, Aaron Bender.
I keep forgetting to check. Do I have trail mix in my... No, okay.
Trail mix?
No, I had trail mix
all
earlier.
things?
That's my breakfast.
Oh,
That's
okay.
my breakfast. It's in the break room. So,
Yes.
Marriage family therapist on the show today. Really,
Yes.
the emphasis there is masculine v feminine and how they work together in relationships. And not the first time we've had a guest like this on the show, and I'm
Right.
curious what is kind of appealing to you about this dynamic.
Oh, I think it's so fascinating. I think relationships in general are so fascinating. I mean, maybe it's because it's an occupational hazard. Like I deal in relationships and the breakdown of them. And so after doing that for a couple decades, you do start to see patterns. And so I just think the dynamics of relationships are really fascinating. And in the past few years, I've become aware of this whole like masculine, feminine sort of balance in relationships. And I think it's so fascinating.
Wait, so this is not something that you've been attuned to, like you met Jeff, married Jeff because of this masculine, feminine energy, like consciously, like saying, I want to find somebody who's super masculine because I'm super feminine, except when I'm at work with a blazer on, but no blazer at home, baby.
That's right. No blazer at home. None allowed. No, I mean, I think a lot of these things are subconscious. So Jeff is probably the most masculine man I know. And I'm, obviously that was very attractive to me. But I think that's partly why this topic kind of resonates with me is because, I see lots of people divorcing and breaking up and all of that. And so I always question like, well, I've been married 20 years. Like how is that so? Yeah. What are we doing right? And of course, nothing is perfect. There's a lot we're doing wrong. But I do think one thing that we've gotten right is which most people are very surprised about, by the way. Like Jeff and I have a very, I think, good balance of masculine and feminine. And most people are very surprised by that.
Curious, though, have you ever, considering, like you said, it's only been the last few years where you've kind of brought it to the surface of your awareness, has there been a time when you're like, you know what, I'm putting on the big boy pants today. I'm going to be in charge. Like, has that ever happened, A, and B, how'd it go?
Well, I mean, the thing about that is like, I don't want to do that. And there's no need for me to do that. Why would I do that when somebody else has always taken the lead, right, is in charge, does it very well? Like, I don't want to do that. But, sometimes just in real life, there are times where it's like, okay, I'm in charge right now. But honestly, I'm terrible at it. I mean, it's surprising that I can get to work every day and do what I do. And sometimes Jeff will look at me and like, really? Like, look at what you do in your professional life. And like, I mean, there was a time where we were in Las Vegas with another family and the guys, my husband and his friend, were at a professional hockey game. And it's like, the kids are hungry. And I'm like, Snuff, the kids are hungry. And he's like, get them something to eat. We walked around Vegas for 2 hours, not able to obtain sustenance for our children. Jeff had to leave the hockey game and he shows up with 25 hamburgers. And it's like, I'm sorry, I'm just a wet noodle around him. Like in his presence, I go limp.
Considering it's Vegas, he was your golden knight in shining armor.
He always is. I am here today with Dené Logan, marriage and family therapist, also has her own podcast, Cheaper Than Therapy, and the author of a newly released book, Sovereign Love, which is absolutely amazing. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Dené, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, I'm so honored. Holly, thank you for having me.
Yes, absolutely. So I do want to jump into this book, and I'm just going to start off by telling everyone this is going to be, our conversation today is going to be a very sort of high level overview because there are so many good things in this book and so many concepts that really deserve like a much deeper dive, but we're limited on time. So we're going to do a high level overview, but I read the book. I highly recommend for everybody to grab a copy because it really sheds so much light on relationships today, right?
Well, thank you for that. I mean,
Yes.
I'm so grateful and I'm so excited to talk to you. I mean, given what you do, I'm just very excited for this conversation, Holly.
Yes, I am too. And thank you so much for being here. So, you may have picked up on the fact that I'm a divorce lawyer. And so, we do kind of a first segment sort of introducing the topic before we start talking to the guest. And Aaron was asking me, like, why does this resonate with you so much? This topic of, not only relationships, but also sort of the balance of the masculine and the feminine in relationships. And I was telling him, like, relationship dynamics are so fascinating to me. But also, I see the demise of so many relationships. And I'm always, as my career has gone on for almost 2 decades, it's like, you start to see the patterns that exist. And I'm always like, why? Like, why are all these relationships falling apart? But I think you have a lot of those answers in the book.
Thank you.
So I think to start with, I do want to read some experts from the book. You are a marriage and family therapist, but one of the things that I found interesting is you do have a little bit of a different approach where you're not just like making people hold on by a thread no matter what, to save their marriage, right? Like, in your book, it says, to me, the work is more about supporting people in living the most authentic, beautiful lives they possibly can, even if that means the dissolution of their relationship. Yeah. So how did you arrive at that place?
Yeah. Well, I think, Holly, I come from a background in depth psychology, and people always think I'm saying death psychology. I'm saying depth, like
depth as in deep,
deep,
right?
Deep psychology.
Yes.
And it's, frequently referred to as like the psychology of the soul. So it's a little bit more of a spiritual lens that we're looking at the work of what it is to be alive and human and go through all of the struggles that we will inevitably encounter. And so I found when I started working with couples that I loved couples work, but I had a very different perspective on what the goal of what we're doing in these relationships should be or is than a lot of the more clinical models of psychology, meaning if this is two people who are ultimately souls having a temporary human experience. And I believe this is a life school. And then we come into this life to learn certain lessons while we're here. What is this relationship dynamic attempting to teach me during the time that we're in this dynamic? And, I think so much of what all of us are raised to understand about relationship dynamics and certainly marriage is that when a marriage ends, it means that two people have failed, right? And so in order to sort of defend against that reality, I find so often that people are really, staying in relationship dynamics long past what I think is really in support of the evolution of each person's soul. And they're doing it because there's just so much like fear that I will certainly be abandoned, certainly be judged by others by not being able to
and
make
shame.
this marriage
Don't
work.
you think it's shame
And shamed,
too?
absolutely. Exiled from the community that the two of us have built together. But more than anything else, it's like that I'm a failure. And I really like to sort of like reclaim that narrative that like nobody's failed. If the goal is to learn and to evolve, then that's what we've done inevitably by colliding and having this relationship,
Yeah. Yeah. And I love how you define relationships. At one point in the book, you talk about, and you kind of just alluded to it right now, but you talk about how really the true purpose of a relationship is basically to support the other person's mission while on this earth, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I love that. That's so beautiful because I think that really, because it's like, I think maybe we're moving on from it now, but there was a time where we've all been socialized into, you talk about, the principle of like being chosen, but also this principle of like, that person completes me. And it's like, we need that person to be a whole person. But the way you've defined relationships is like, we're complete on our own with our own mission while on this earth. And that person really is just helping us fulfill our own purpose. And I love that.
Yeah, I think, when we believe that as we've been sold, like, and this programming starts early. It's like
Very early.
say like the fairy tales are sort of the blueprints for like our codependent tendencies and the way that we're taught to experience relationships. But that if I believe like I'm sort of holding out for the quote one to come along and complete me, what ends up happening is each person in the relationship dynamic, and I'm sure you see this and know this more than anyone else, comes with their own life experience, pain points, things that they experienced to be true about what they were looking for in a relationship, their family of origin, and what things were like in their family. And those things often butt heads once we get a little bit past that like euphoric first stage.
Yes, the honeymoon stage. Yes.
Exactly.
Then all of a sudden reality sets in and it's like, oh man, we, have differences on a lot of these significant things.
Absolutely. And so we feel a little bit disappointed in that person, or like we were sold a lie about like what this sense of fulfillment would be. But I think a lot of times it's not actually that other person's fault. It's more about us questioning, like, was that ever someone else's responsibility to be and do that for me?
Right. Yes. I know you talk about how like we all kind of get to this place in our life. And I know for me, it was like when I turned 40 and I suddenly it was a traumatic thing going on in my life at the time. And I sort of like woke up, and that was actually when I realized, oh, like putting all these things on another person is far too great a burden for any one person to bear. And it's like, another person, no one person on the outside can ever fulfill all of our needs. But again, like we have been so socialized into thinking that. So how do we, I know you talk about the like one of the ways that we have created sort of these unsustainable relationships is like the ways we self-abandon. Yeah. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think, we live in a society, and certainly from my perspective, all of our relational models up to this point have really supported the idea that like the most important thing is creating a secure attachment. And for anybody who's listening who doesn't know what I mean when I talk about like a secure attachment, an attachment is like you have primary attachment figures in childhood, and they give you a sense of like the world is safe, you're going to be okay. And sort of like before as children, we have the ability to self-soothe and sort of have that understanding for ourselves. It would be our primary caregivers in an ideal world. It would be their responsibility to give that to us. Now, what's ended up happening is we've sort of continued the attachment conversation into adulthood, and that our adult relationships and partnerships should offer that secure attachment as well. Now, all of us do need attachment. We have two fundamental needs as humans. We need attachment, but we also need authenticity. And the attachment is like something that I'm rooted in, a connection to like others, a sense of like, this is what I know I can depend on, I can belong somewhere. But the authenticity is the life force, the eros, the sensuality, the feminine, right? And so our society has really sort of put so much emphasis on the structure and the solidifying the relationship and the masculine ways of doing things, but not a lot of emphasis on the eros and the feminine and all of those things. And so when we just put the emphasis on the structure, we end up feeling like, yes, this person isn't going anywhere, and that's what I'm putting all of my faith in, but there's not a lot of eros. There's not a lot of, aliveness in our dynamics. And it's why so many couples end up feeling a lot of like roommate dynamics, eventually feeling a lot of like there's no life here, and things happen. Like when we suppress something, it comes to the surface. And sometimes that looks like an affair. Sometimes that looks like, just ways that I'm like what we would call like a midlife crisis or something. And it's like, is it a midlife crisis, or are we just sort of like having this feminine aspect of ourselves finally coming to the surface after suppressing it for so long,
So what is the answer to maintaining that sense of eros in a relationship? How do we do that?
I love that. Yeah, it's really taking responsibility for our own energy. And so in the book, I talk about like how to be in relationship with certainly the inquiry around the story I'm telling myself in any given moment that we feel challenged with our partner and in any of our relationships really, but then like taking responsibility for my energy for myself. But then just like, I think this fundamental understanding that like we meet our relationships with a completely different level of reverence and holding them as sacred when we believe that this person doesn't belong to me. Now, that's a challenging statement that I say a lot. And it's sort of the hill I'm willing to die on. And I'm sure you can understand as a divorce attorney why I say that. The idea that another person ever, quote, belongs to me is certainly something that like a society that we were all raised with an ownership template. Love means I belong to you. You're mine, right? But if you think about the things that are, quote, yours, you kind of start to get used to them being around and maybe even taking them for granted and not really like celebrating them all the time. And so if I didn't believe that my partner was going to be here tomorrow, how might I show up a little bit more mindfully? How might I really celebrate them? How might I just be more impeccable with my words, really, to be honest, right? Like just versus sort of using them as the release valve for all my stress and tension, really being intentional with my energy and the way that I'm showing up.
So that's really interesting. How does that play into like a secure attachment? Because I think, I think about like myself. Aaron, my producer, was asking me about my marriage and my husband before the show. And, he like, I feel very secure with him. And so he's probably like the only man on the planet that I have not tried to like mind game my way, in or out of it.
Aaron or your partner?
And
no comment from the corner here, please. No comment.
I was like, are you saying Aaron or your partner?
My Jeff, my husband, is like
with
the
your
only
husband.
Yes, that I
zero masculine energy coming from this corner.
But I do feel it's because he has like made me feel very secure. But I think what you're saying is so important to understand. Is it's like, when you think something's going to be there forever, you don't quite have the same appreciation. And I love the word that you used, reverence for it. So how do we sort of reconcile the concept of like feeling super secure with someone, like, like they will be there forever. You don't have to do all this weird manipulation of them to make sure they stay around, with sort of this concept of like having the mindset that like, this doesn't belong to me. Like I need to be impeccable with my word. I need to have the mindset of like really caring and celebrating them. How do we reconcile those two things?
Yeah, well, couple things. And this is like, I don't know this to be true, but this is an assumption I'm making because you were talking about this thing that happens for women, certainly around like age 38 to like 42. And we go through a real shift in the psyche where we do start to come into a different level of an embodied self. And a lot of times that comes with some sort of like catalyst or reckoning in our life that sort of like, it becomes like an awakening and a remembrance of like who we are and our feminine power, right? So again, I don't know this to be true, but I'm making an assumption about you, Holly, that there was probably a fair amount of work that you had to do in that period of time that required you coming into a different level of capital S self, as I like to call it. Now, when I do that, what ends up happening is my energetic frequency, the way I'm showing up in the world shifts, and I start to attract a different level of partner. I would imagine that your partner, in the way you're describing, it's not so much that he, quote, made you feel secure, is your level of security within who you are as a self was a vibrational match for him and who he was and who he was showing up as in this life. And I just find inevitably, because this is what I believe from a soul perspective, we draw in what we're ready for, right?
Yes,
so it's like, these are all soul lessons. But if I'm at the point of my development where I am ready to be with a man who can meet me in that space and sort of hold space for me and the woman that I have become, that's what I'll attract. But I won't attract a man like that until I'm ready for him,
Right. Okay. And I think this really goes back to being responsible for your own energy, right? It's like and I see this a lot too, Instagram, my primary research platform, talking about relationships where it's like, if you're still single and you don't want to be anymore, like you kind of have to become the best version of yourself in order to attract what you are hoping to attract.
Yeah. I realize I didn't actually answer the question that you asked, but like, I don't think we ever should fully have a secure attachment to another person. And that's a little bit of a controversial statement because a lot of times that's so what we've been like conditioned to see as the goal. But I think like the integration of our masculine and feminine is the security and the aliveness. And we do need both. So a little bit, I think the goal should not be to create a secure attachment with another person. It's like with a secure attachment with like something bigger. And then that becomes the third entity that joins the relationship. It's like you and me. And then the thing that we are both like striving towards, either the mission or what we believe to be true about relationships. But I just have this theory after working with couples for a while that like our relationship structures are going to change as these patriarchal structures fall.
Yes.
And what that's going to look like in the future is going to be people joining in relationships not because they're incomplete, but because it's justified based on, a shared vision of what they want out of life, and that who this person is so unbelievably inspiring to me and, makes me want to be a better version of myself, that it's just like the inevitable outcome that we would join in partnership, but we're not going to have the attachment to when things end or change form. That means that somehow from an ego perspective, like anything catastrophic has happened. Like, I think that's how we're evolving, but that's just sort of my theory.
In your book, you do talk about how sort of the traditional construct of marriage or relationships in general really needs to evolve. So what do you exactly mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, when I started really researching relationships and really patriarchal structures in general, and I went back to like, most of us weren't raised with a way of conceptualizing that patriarchy wasn't like the start of how we identified in terms of relationship structures. There were matriarchal cultures. There was a time when women sort of sat in circles together in women, and men would come in as like almost like ceremonial like rituals to impregnate women. And there would be, other ways of being other than the nuclear family structure. Most of us weren't raised in our education systems to learn about that. But as you go back and you learn about the origin points of history, or excuse me, of patriarchy, what you understand is there was a way in order to create like dominance-based structures. And when I talk about patriarchy, I just want to be so unbelievably clear. I'm not talking about men. To me, patriarchy does not equate men, doesn't even really equate like necessarily like masculinity. What it is sort of more in alignment with is like dominance-based ways of structuring things, right? And so in order to create a sense of dominance and eventually create fear within like the feminine collective and remove women from circles and sort of like being together in a collectivist way of being as women, which we used to be, there were ways that we had to harm women and that we had to do things to scare women into believing if you aren't chosen, you won't be safe. And sometimes what that looked like was things like burning women alive and calling them witches, right? And things like that were sort of like the actual origin point of why that was done was to instill a sense of fear in women that if you don't sort of fall in line with partnership in this specific way, you won't be safe. Now, why that matters is like we've never had a reckoning with that. It didn't even occur to me until years later in doing this work with couples. Women couldn't even have their own bank accounts until like 1974. And so if you think about like the relational research that was done in the 70s, it's all sort of drawing from the idea of like, this is what these couples are telling us about like what brings them relational fulfillment. But if I can't even have my own bank account and my independence is sort of contingent upon whether or not like I'm safe because this relationship structure stays intact, I'm not getting a real authentic sense of what creates relational fulfillment between these two people. And so to me, as we evolve and women are in a point where when we're with men, we love our brothers, like absolutely we want to be with men, but it's because it's like, this is the choice that I want to make, not because I need you for my survival anymore. But that requires that our relationships evolve as well,
Yeah. So the book talks about relationships as life sentences. And
I'm like, yes. Everyone's like, oh, well.
And I certainly, see a lot of that because, when people come to me, they're looking to, they're looking for release from the life sentence. I just want to read a part of the book. If our intimate relationships end up being one of the most significant factors influencing how we feel about our lives, it would seem that experiencing a sense of authentic fulfillment in these relationships would be something our society would collectively prioritize. But then you go on to say, I can't remember if it's right here or somewhere else in the book, like, but in fact, we don't really prioritize that because we celebrate things like length of marriage, celebrating, 50 years of marriage, even though maybe the couple is miserable. We celebrate longevity and more so the structure rather than like the vitality of the relationship. Yeah. So what can we do as people who are either in a relationship right now or want to be in a relationship one day? What can we do to make sure that we don't end up in a life sentence and that's, and we don't have that mindset around our relationship?
Yeah, I think whether we're talking about our romantic relationships or parents or being parents or whatever the thing is, like the best thing we can do for all of our relationships is really work on ourselves, right? And of course, I'm a therapist saying that, but I do believe that to be the case. I think we just show up in all of our relationship dynamics differently when we are in right relationship with ourselves and when we're not attempting to sort of energetically pull from those in our lives because we believe that we are lacking something within. And so, yes, I believe the more that we know ourselves, we just make different choices. And a lot of times it's that thing of like, when our younger selves made a choice to be in a relationship, we didn't know ourselves that well. So we have to
Right.
hold ourselves with so much compassion when it feels like,
Yes.
yeah, this isn't really aligned with who I'm becoming anymore. Nobody's
Right.
failed, but it's no longer in alignment. But I know myself now. So I'm starting to know some of these things about me.
So that being said, do you think it is possible to be in like a relationship for 50 years and remain in alignment that whole time?
Yes, and like that's the
Okay.
biggest yes and. Like I think I often say to couples, if you're in relationship with the same person for a lifetime, you will be in relationship with like 4 to 5 different people within the
Yes.
context of that same relationship. And what I mean when I say that is all of us are meant to continue to shift and change and evolve, and we don't really normalize that as a culture. We sort of think like from 0 to
Right.
18 people grow and they evolve and then they're
Right.
done, and that's just not real. But I
Right.
think the relationships that I really see people thriving and they stay together for a lifetime is when it's like, I'm not threatened by you changing. I'm not,
Yeah.
afraid or like feel like I'm being somehow shortchanged that like you're into new things and you're making new friends and all of these things. Like that excites me. That feels like
Right.
aliveness and eros and all of the things we're talking about.
Yes.
But if I need you to stay the same or I feel threatened by your growth, then I think that's where couples get into trouble.
We touched a little bit before on a midlife crisis.
Mm.
And, we have lots of jokes around it and memes and, the middle-aged man buying the Porsche and things like that. What is your take on the midlife crisis?
I really like to, and I call it in the book, like, I think of it more as a midlife awakening. And there's a way that you sort of spoke to, there's a way that this happens for us as women around our late 30s, early 40s, where I think, especially even more now, the divorce rate gets really high for women around that period of time. There's like, I mean, you probably know this better than I would, but there's a huge percentage of divorces are actually initiated by women.
Yes.
And a lot of times there's this thing of like, I'm just awakening to the self that's been dormant within. I think that's true of men as well, but I think that there's a way that, when it happens for women, we've sort of made that like we call women, quote, crazy, and that she's just hormonal and she needs
Yeah.
to like get medicated in some way to like
Right.
suppress whatever this thing is, where it's actually a really normal developmental stage that we go through as women for men as well. But I think it's been a lot more societally not accepted because we kind of make jokes about it, like, oh,
Yeah.
he's getting a younger woman and buying a sports car and whatever. But
Right.
I think it's just we sort of reach this point at the midpoint of our lives where we realize like this isn't a dress rehearsal. I get this one life, I'm halfway through, and I am going to die, right? And so it's sort of
Yeah.
this existential crisis that I just start to like really question, like, how do I want to live if my time in this body is limited?
Right. Yeah. So do you think that sort of awakening, in your, 30s or 40s is absolutely necessary? Or is there something that we can teach our daughters or our kids, now that where they don't have that sort of awakening, that midlife crisis, if you will? Or is that just like a necessary part of the process?
I love it. You asked the best questions, Holly.
Thank you.
Yeah, I love this question because what I've seen, I facilitate a lot of retreats for women. And sometimes I'll have women from different age groups. And I had this one retreat where it was like women who were, a little bit older than me, and then women who were like 20 years younger than me. So like a little substantial gap in the two groups of women in terms of their age bracket. And the older women were experiencing a lot of grief around, their children had left the home and they'd created an identity around like being wife and mother and just
Yes.
realized they'd been self-abandoning for so much of their lives, right? And then it was fascinating because this younger group of women in their 20s were like, we're not doing that. Like there was so much about like what they saw with their mothers and like why they were like, we're just like deprioritizing romantic relationships and our yoni is sacred. And if a man wants to step to me, he needs to come in this kind of way. And I was like, girl, if I had what you have when I was 20, I can't even imagine. Like it was beautiful. But I feel like there's a way that this younger generation of women are different. Like they're really like empowered in like seeing with eyes wide open some of the things we're talking about. Like they're aware of patriarchy in a way that we weren't when we were their age, right? And they're not so concerned with being chosen and that should be the priority. Now, of course, now that's not everyone, but I was really like, you guys are giving me so much hope for this next generation of kiddos. I love it. But yeah, I think it's a little bit of the children shall lead them type of thing, you know?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm really interested in your take on this because we had a guest on the show maybe a month or two ago now, and he was talking about healthy masculinity. And one of the things that he talked about is basically, like in his opinion, you know, men are basically born to serve women. Like the masculine is sort of born to serve the feminine. Yeah. So with this new generation coming up that maybe is more of the thought that, you know, we don't need men as much and we're going to deprioritize romantic relationships and things like that. What is your take on, I guess first, what is your take on, you know, women, the masculine was sort of born to serve the feminine. And then how does this new generation coming up sort of affect that balance, if you believe that balance should exist?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question. I actually do agree with your guest.
Okay.
To an extent, I think that there is something that is so unbelievably healing and like becomes like a mission and like that sense of purpose for a core masculine man when he is in love with a woman and just like has that really strong desire to give. And if you think about like even anatomically, the masculine is the giver, the feminine is the receiver, right? Like that's what we do. And so there's a lot about that energetically that is actually, it's like magnets. Like that is some of like what creates that draw to one another. And it is actually healthy energetics. Now, that being said, I think there's been so many distortions for centuries that what is required for us to get back to that place of like coming into union from those healthy spaces of like, I can feel safe enough to receive from you and to soften into you and to trust in who you are as my man really requires what we were talking about before, me being in a solid sense of self and that like, I'm not like looking for you to complete me, but I see you for all that you are. And I deeply appreciate that. And I can tell you, like, I have come into so much more appreciation for the masculine with a solid sense of self. Like, the more that I get solid in who I am, the more that I'm not like demanding things from a man. But when a man is there and present and is really desiring to give, which I think, you know, is a little bit of when I talk about the distortions, so many of us as women were raised like, don't be needy and you can do it. And like, I'm a woman and I don't need you to do all of those things for me. And it's not from the space of demanding, but again, for like deep reverence and appreciation when a man does meet me in that space. And so it's not that I need you to do this, but when you do, one, that feels like I use my discernment and I want a man who is like hungry to do those things for me, but also I'm so unbelievably like grateful and see him for who he is when he does those things, you know?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked a little, like you mentioned about, you know, you have to just do the work. You have to work on yourself. In practical terms, what does that actually look like? How do we, because your book talks about like reclaiming the masculine and reclaiming the feminine. Like, how do we actually do that in real life?
Yeah, I think it's so much of like the work of reclaiming ourselves is like, I love to say like going back for the little girl or the little boy that we were before the world told us who we needed to be like, quote, acceptable or, you know, and just like really getting in right relationship with like, who am I though? Like, what are the things that bring me a sense of authentic aliveness and where do I feel most safe and comfortable in my skin? And if I don't know, beautiful. That's like the starting point of your journey. Let's get in there and do that. Absolutely. I love that. Yes. And so it becomes, I'm not looking for someone else to do that for me. because so much of what we've done is sort of make relationships the place that we hide out from doing that exploration and painting our canvas, right? So no, like we're both painting this beautiful canvas of life, and when it's aligned, because where we are on our path is just like synchronistically sort of, it's funny. I feel like so much more of our work is about following the breadcrumbs of our bliss, allowing ourselves to really be in present, centered awareness with our lives and ourselves, and then trusting that everything that we're meant to experience will find us. Like, we don't have to be out here like, how do I find the man? How do I like make this relationship work? It's like, just stop, less, and just trust in, if you're following your authentic bliss, like all of those things are going to find you, I promise.
Right. Oh my gosh. That takes a certain amount of trust though, right? And maybe patience
the
too.
Most trust.
Yeah.
So much trust. Yeah.
Yes. And I think that's, I think that's where people struggle is like, I think a lot of people, they want to be in control, and it's very hard to sit back and let it come to you. Do you agree?
Absolutely. There's, I think it's the biggest work of our life to learn to trust and like get out of the process of attempting to control life. But I think, you were talking before about these moments that bring us to that point of surrender where we finally give up the illusion that we've been in control. It's always an illusion that we get to control life. But when we finally it's like we're like in a boat, like sort of paddling against the current, right? And then finally when we let go and we just trust that the current's going to take us where we're meant to end up, it all of a sudden is like, oh God, this was so easy. Why didn't I just trust in life a little bit more? But you're right. It's big spiritual work. And I think that that's a little bit societally what we've lost track of.
Right. And that's really what I'm getting from this conversation is like there is absolutely an element of spirituality to this whole thing. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. When I think about the integration of our masculine and feminine energetics, to me, it is spiritual work. It's like seeing a relationship as a divine assignment. And how do I get back in relationship with like larger meaning and what I came into this life to do? And I think that is, to me, the rise of the feminine, because the feminine is the soul within all of us. And what I think is happening and shifting for us collectively is like we're coming back to a society where we put meaning over sort of productivity and, getting more stuff and all of the like the things that we've just been focused on for a long time that I think are no longer sustainable. I mean, if you look like we're destroying the earth that we inhabit, and it's sort of like we're having this reckoning collectively, like what kind of a society, what kind of a human race do we want to be?
Yes. Oh my gosh. This is good stuff. Yeah. And I mean, we are just scratching the surface. I could talk to you for so much longer, but everybody just needs to get your book because you go into a lot more depth in all of these things in your book. Also, I love your content on Instagram. I mean, I see some things, I'm like, oh my God, I got chills. Like that is so profound. That's amazing. So, Dené, thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for being on Made for More. This has been so delightful and a wonderful discussion with you.
Oh, Holly, thank you so much. And thank you for the work you're doing. I truly appreciate you so much. And I appreciate this opportunity to meet you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I've got just a little bit more to say. My mom used to always tell me, you can't control what happens to you in life, only your reaction to it. And I think that's really some of the things that Dené was telling us during my conversation with her is we all have this illusion that we are in control of our lives, but it's just that, an illusion. We're really not in control. The only thing we have control over is the work that we're doing on ourselves. So as long as we are working on ourselves, getting to know ourselves. And I love what she said about just finding the little things that give us bliss. We're on our way. And once we're on our way, we're going to show up as the best version of ourselves because we are all made for more.